Okay, welcome everyone to a very special webinar. We're going to be talking about the role of bioavailable copper. You're in for a ride. If there's any parts of this which seem a little technical and you're not familiar with it, don't worry, you'll be able to access a recording after the fact. And Morley, and watch that multiple times if need be. Morley, you do a pretty good job of explaining complex things, so I'm going to hand over to you and let you get started.
Well, I'll do my best. I think many of you know me as Magnesium Man, and I seem to be morphing my way into a new direction. So I'm gradually transitioning from the curmudgeon, CU, right, to a name that Marilyn introduced me to, Curandongo, which is our healing artist in South America. And it probably will emerge on the back end as Cooperman. But we'll see. But I appreciate your taking time to be here today, learn a little bit more about the origin of copper on the planet and what its role is. I think it's a great story, but it's not a well-known story. So appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more. Our focus, we're going to learn how the foods and supplements that we're taking just aren't providing enough copper. And it's a real serious issue worldwide. It's not just here in the States, it's all continents. Probably the most important thing to understand is that we use the phrase bioavailable copper within the RCP. There's a reason for that copper is a mineral, but it's made bioavailable through its insertion into key proteins and enzymes so that it can do work. And as I was mentioning to some folks yesterday, enzymes are where minerals meet metabolism. It's a real fun way to think about it. But they're little engines. We can't live without them. I don't know how many thousands there are in our body, but a lot. And the ones that are most important as it relates to copper are what are called copper pumps, ATP7A and ATP7B. And these are really critical for optimal health, particularly of the humankind. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Probably a very important message is to learn that copper is not toxic and that we are not anemic. We just have to learn how to read hair tests and blood tests accurately and understanding the nuance of how minerals express themselves in those tests. And it's a far cry from what we've been trained to believe. And we'll have a chance to talk more about that. And I'm sure it'll be an active part of the Q&A in a couple of weeks, because there's a lot of programming out there that says we're all anemic and we're all copper toxic. And it's like, well, there's more to the story. Let's just leave it at that. Always a surprise is for people, a lot of people know that copper is involved in making energy, but a lot of people don't know of its extensive network of enzymes that it gets involved in to clear exhaust. And that's really critically important, especially inside the mitochondria. And some of you may know of the enzyme that's in the mitochondria. It's referred to as SOD2. It's the manganese SOD. Well, it's more complicated than that. And we are living in a world where, with increasing frequency, that SOD is actually flipping to iron SOD, and it's causing oxidative stress. And so it's another side of metabolic dynamics that not everyone knows about. And then, of course, we'll be happy to talk with you about the RCP community and the Institute and what we're devoted to in terms of educating the public and practitioners to better understand these key mineral relationships. So that's kind of an overview of where we're headed over the next 50 some minutes while we're together. For those who don't know me, I'm a dad to 4 adult children, a very talented group of offspring, very proud of them. And I really see myself as an educator and a self-taught mineral expert. I never imagined that I would be so impassioned and so enthralled by very dense academic studies, but it's a source of excitement for me, and I'm very delighted to be here, and appreciate the chance to have these sessions where we can share what we know and stimulate the neurons out in the world out there. I've been a change agent my entire career, never shied away from change. In fact, as a hospital consultant, I was the change. So I was the change agent, and CEOs would hire us to make things different, make things better, improve the operating performance of the organization. We took the slings and arrows, and the CEO was able to rise above the fray of the activity. But no less excitement being a change agent here, trying to get people to focus on the truth of our metabolism, not the narrative of our metabolism. And I like to think of myself as a self-appointed health czar. And as I think many of you know, I have some pretty strong opinions about how to get and stay healthy. And I really enjoy separating fact from fiction. A lot of people like to cut the corners. I like to really take the effort to make sure that people understand how that corner was made. And my catchphrase, this will probably be on my tombstone: we've been misled and we've been misfed. I don't have plans to check out. Don't worry about that. I'm just trying to think of what would be a pithy thing to say that would last for the ages. And I think that would be appropriate. That would at least get people to ask questions like, who was that guy? So that's me. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague and partner in crime, Christine Kershaw. Please share your insights, if you would.
Thank you, Morley. So yes, I am a mum to three. The littlest person is why I came to the RCP in the end. She was very unwell as a little baby, and I went through all of the mainstream medical kind of things. She got diagnosed with a very long named thing and told, well, that's just the way she'll be. And when I said, is there anything that I can do to help her health? They kind of went, no, just time. And then she'll still be much the same for the next however many years. Anyway, in the same time frame, by doing the RCP, she ended up with none of the symptoms that she started off with. And now as a 9-year-old, you wouldn't know any different. But she'd had that rough start. She's a pretty tough little tough cookie, and the rest of the family have benefited massively as well. Next point, please, Morley.
Yes, my apologies.
I do have a background in science. I've worked in everything from universities providing laboratory setups for science and nursing classes to working in molecular biology. I've also got a background in being a technical writer and trainer. So that kind of brings all of my skills together to then help me do what I now do for the RCP. And the next one. So I'm an RCP consultant. I trained with Morley back in 2017 and have been helping people long before that, realistically. Unofficially, as it were, people were saying, oh, when are you going to do consults, before there was anything of the RCP Institute, or back then the Copernican Institute. And over time, I've come to help Morley with the training, with presentations like this, and I help behind the scenes in pretty much everything as the business goes now. When I'm not doing RCP things, I love gardening. And
when are you not doing RCP things? Come on.
Well, at the moment, not a whole lot. It's very early in the morning on a Wednesday, and I'm here in my office, not sleeping. Oh, you know.
What's the temperature outside?
It's pretty close to freezing where I am, so
right.
It's a little chilly. It's warm in the house though, so I've only got 2 layers of warmth on. Oh dear.
Aussie talk.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm just soft now. I think I feel the cold a lot more than I used to when I used to ride horses a lot. Okay, next point, please.
Yep.
And funnily enough, I'm sure you may have gathered a little bit of this. I do love to help others learn to find their way. So my premise is very much around helping people to learn to fish, so to speak. rather than providing them with a fish. I would much rather help to guide people to learn and find their own path than be the guru, so to speak. So I do that whether it's with everyone who's attending today or in our training or when I work with people one-to-one. So,
and I can say as the old dog in this team that it's not uncommon for Christiane to make videos, to introduce me to new ways to do things. It's like, I don't know where she finds the time to do it, but thank you. And it's great to have you on board. And look forward to dancing on minds today.
Yeah, no worries at all. Now we've had a couple of messages saying, could you possibly increase your volume a little? So could you be mindful of, that'll be your directed at the mic type volume rather than turning any settings up, because there's nothing we can do. So for anyone wondering if we can turn the volume up, I can ask Morley to turn his volume up, but other than that, you'll have to adjust your devices. So
I'm cranked up as far as I can go.
Yeah.
This is unfortunately a familiar refrain.
Yeah.
I don't know what we don't know what the issue is, but I'll apologize if there's any difficulty hearing my message. Hopefully that's a little better.
It all sounds good to me, so hopefully.
Okay. Well, I'll leave it to the people that are supposed to hear this will hear this.
Yeah.
All right. Well, our organizing paradigm, some of you have probably seen this before, but for those who are new, we really fixate on creating energy. And what it really, the whole paradigm is that we're very aware that iron carries oxygen like a waiter, but only copper harnesses that oxygen to optimize creating energy. It's a very different role between being a waiter and being a chef. And so iron via hemoglobin is the waiter, and that's where the biggest bulk of iron is in the body. And the chef is working tirelessly at complex 4 in our 40 quadrillion mitochondria, making sure we have enough energy to get through the day and get through the metabolic functions that we have. But it goes on to clear exhaust, it catalyzes enzymes, and it combats enemies. Yet there's no other element on the planet that has that kind of reach and impact. And there's compelling evidence and proof that copper does all 4 of those. So it just puts copper into a very unique class as a mineral. And unfortunately, what happens is these two metals can get out of balance with each other. And even though there's a very striking difference, which we'll see in a minute, about the representation of these two metals, they are what are called redox active, means they're responding to reduction and oxidation activity inside the cell and inside the mitochondria. And when they get out of sync with each other, oxygen doesn't get metabolized properly. And that's the very origin of what's called oxidative stress. And that's the fancy term for rust. Well, we know what rust is. We know what a rusty nail looks like, or a rusty pipe, or a rusty car. Well, that same rusting process can take place inside our body. And when iron mixes with oxygen, that's when you get rust. And there's only one element in biological systems that can keep those two in proper regulation, and that's copper. Copper has a unique ability to keep iron and oxygen in proper regulation. And there are many very fancy chemicals inside our body, neurotransmitters, catecholamines, hormones. And what are they responding to? They're responding to the state of oxygen in our tissue. And I take a very different stance about these chemicals, that they are not running our body, but they're responding to our environment. And that's a big difference. So I think minerals are where it's at. And understanding the role that they play to keep things in balance and keep the energy train moving. But these reactive chemicals that are very powerful are responding to the oxidative stress that's emerging in the tissue. And so it's this rising and unchecked oxidative stress that causes enzymes to stop working, and they all respond to that oxidative stress. And that's when our symptoms begin. And as humans, what we do, we're very gullible. And we take these symptoms, this bag full of symptoms, into our doctor, and we empty the bag onto their desk, and they look through it and sort it out. And the doctor looks it up in the Merck manual and says, oh, well, based on these symptoms, you have XYZ syndrome. And because we're very gullible, we believe that. And therein lies the problem. Because the origin of the problem is lack of energy because of rising oxidative stress, because copper is not doing its job. So our goal, the RCP, is designed to optimize the conversion of oxygen to ATP with minimal exhaust, therefore minimal oxidative stress. That's really what drives us as an organization. It's what drives our training, and we feel very strongly about its central role in our physiology. So it's said that a lie told once remains a lie. A lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. And while this is a very uncomfortable saying from a very uncomfortable historical
Lie
figure,
told once remains a lie.
I think this is exactly right.
A lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. But that's not true.
So I will continue.
Yeah, please do. Please, everyone, don't unmute during the presentation. I've tried to block it, but unfortunately I can't. So we'd appreciate you not disturbing the flow of the meeting. Thank you.
So one of the key figures that we are aware of course, is Mark Twain. And it ain't what we don't know that gets us into trouble. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so. And that's true across all disciplines of our lives. And I think that the challenge we face is we know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. And that's where we've put a lot of emphasis, particularly in the research, is to really understand mineral metabolism. And it's very well researched. I don't think it's very well taught, especially in practitioner schools. And it's a critical part of academia that seems to be lost in the classroom. And so there's a lot of opinions out there about what's right and wrong, what to do, what not to do. And we know that opinions are different than facts. And what's happened is, I think in this modern era, we've become vaccinated because there's so many facts. And I think what we caution people to do is don't confuse your facts with what we perceive as the truth. And again, is there an absolute truth? I don't know, that's a debatable point. But there seems to be a consistency of truth when you get into the research. And that's really where we put a lot of emphasis, is trying to discern what are these studies all about, what are they really trying to reveal, and begin to align their messaging in a way that we can share it with the public. So one of our cornerstone phrases is missing information equals missing truth. Very grateful to Pastor Joey Foster for showing that wisdom many years ago. And I think we can all go back to the first time that we saw The Wizard of Oz, saw that big talking head. It was just amazingly frightening to see it for the first time. And then as the movie unfolded, there was a real shift that took place when the curtain gets pulled back to reveal who was behind the talking head. And what I want to make sure you understand is that we're Toto pulling back the curtain to make sure that people understand what are the wheels and dials that are being turned in the research, but also behind the scenes of what might be leading some practitioners to take one stance versus another. And so we take a lot of pride in trying to understand that in a unique way. And I think the challenge we face, and the reason why we're having this conversation today, is there is a tremendous amount of confusion about copper. And the way I would describe it is we live in a very cupro agnostic world. People have learned that, copper is toxic and got to stay away from it. Well, that's like saying that you can drown in a bathtub, and it can happen. It's like, that doesn't mean we should stop taking baths. It doesn't mean we should stop going in swimming pools. It means we should learn how to swim, right? Well, we need to learn how to work with this essential mineral that I think is at the base of our metabolism. So let me get into the guts of the presentation, if you will. Basic premise is copper is not toxic. That's a narrative. And iron is not deficient, just more narrative. I mean, think about it. 36% of the Earth's composition is iron. And the most evolved species on the planet is having trouble metabolizing it? That doesn't make sense. The most evolved species is struggling with the number one element. Well, that means there's something missing. And when you get into the research, what you find is that every facet of iron metabolism is copper dependent, but that's not how it's taught. And therein lies the problem. Missing information equals missing truth. And that's why we have the RCP community and why we have the RCP Institute and why we labor to make sure people understand these basic principles, because that is all narrative. And what we are really seeking to do is make sure that people know that copper is missing in action on a scale that's a little unnerving, and that iron is stuck. And there's a really critical recycling program around iron. The biggest bulk of our iron is in hemoglobin. It's 70% of our iron in our body is tied up in hemoglobin. And every second of every day, we need to make 2.5 million red blood cells, 200 billion every 24 hours. And so we've been together for 25 minutes, times 60, times 2.5 million. It's an enormous amount of energy that goes into recycling those red blood cells. And that is at the direction of copper. But most of you have never heard that. So if we accept that copper is MIA and the iron is stuck, it's good to know that there's research to back that up. And this is the very tip of the iceberg of the research. I've had the pleasure of reading about 7,000 studies, not all of them directed at copper and iron, because in the beginning I was obsessed with magnesium, as many of you know that. But the cornerstone is it's the lack of bioavailable copper, that causes iron accumulation. And where does it accumulate? First and foremost in our liver. When did they first know that? 1928. Number 3, Hart, Steenbach, Waddell, and LVM. Groundbreaking discovery. And then reinforced in 2018 with the work of Ming Song on non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome. And then 3 years after that, 2021, Leon Gonzalez proved it genetically, that in the face of copper deficiency, there's only one gene that fires up, and it's called the ferritin light chain gene. And that's the gene that tells the liver, store iron, store iron. And it does it quietly, very efficiently, and I think it's at the base of most of our problems metabolically. So here's an example of a study done in 1983 that reinforces that message, that there is hepatic iron accumulation in copper deficiency. In this case, we're studying rats, those poor little critters. And what they really were very clear about is how subtle this dynamic is that's not talked about. It's not openly studied in the classroom setting, at least that I'm not aware of. And yet it's at the basis of the food system on this planet, because there's been a very distinct loss of copper in the soil, in the plants, and in the animals over the last 80 years. And copper deficiency has been identified as the #1 nutrient deficiency on the farm for 60 years. Well, that's a long time to be without copper. So it's a phenomenon that not a lot of people know about. And this particular study was a footnote in a major study by Myra Fields and her colleagues back in 1997. She referenced the study by Dr. Williams. And she also pointed out that this is an article that she wrote where she was talking about ferritin not being an accurate indicator when copper is not bioavailable. That's a really important thing to know. That serum ferritin, which is a very popular way to measure iron, is not accurate in folks who are challenged by their copper status. That would be everyone on this call, including me. And so there's a lot of confusion about this in the public and in the professional circles. So it's something that we constantly are striving to overcome. So many of you might know that there was a time when there was no oxygen on the planet. I don't really know how the astrobiologists know this, but I'll accept that first face value that they do know what they're talking about. But when oxygen did appear over a course of many, many millions of years, it wiped out 99% of life on the planet. And that's a big deal. Iron has a critical role in nature, serves very, very important functions. But what's hiding in a lot of the research is the fact that copper is enabling iron to do its work. And iron is not unlike the steel girders in a building. Can't build a building without steel girders. But what's running the utilities? Copper wire and copper pipes. Nobody talks about that. So if you've got to move elements, water and electrons, copper is really important. And it's not only important in buildings, it's important in bodies too. So this is the work of Robert Crichton and his colleague, Dr. Pierre, and then Kaplan and O'Halloran. These are fascinating studies to read, but they give us a very different perspective of what's going on. And this is another way of looking at it. I actually found this in a high school biology textbook. Like, wow, what a great picture. But what it explains is the evolution of life based around the change of oxygen status on the planet was very, very low, in the very beginning, if you can accept that time frame. And what's fascinating is here we are, kind of late entrance to the process. And there's something called the Great Oxygen Event, when there was 0.1% of oxygen. That's the threshold that caused the loss of 99% of life. And what was actually happening was oxygen was reacting with the iron that was running the planet. And it's very important to understand that time frame. And what really saved life on the planet were three critical elements that are tied to copper. So there's enzymes called multi-copper oxidases. These are very important in terms of their ability to convert oxygen into water. So take one oxygen molecule, O2, and these enzymes can turn them into two molecules of H2O2. Excuse me, two molecules of water, 2H2O. My apologies. But the enzyme or the hormone, I guess, melatonin, goes all the way back to the beginning of time. And then, of course, cholesterol. Cholesterol has been on the planet for a long time. And this idea that it's the source of disease is laughable at best. And unfortunately, these types of concepts are not openly understood in professional circles. But the role that copper plays to work with oxygen, particularly in an environment with iron, is instrumental. And it's so essential to our well-being and our energy production and our ability to clear the exhaust, not to mention getting rid of the pathogens. So copper serves many different roles, as many of you know. The particular capstone events are as building blocks of our pathways, but particularly as enzymes for the antioxidant system. And most people don't know about that side of copper. It's really, really important. Many different functions that are served by copper, and we'll see some other examples in a few minutes. But the part that I think is most fascinating is there's a very significant role that copper plays in our DNA, which is not well understood. There's a famous researcher named Dr. Gregoriadis. He was at University of London. And back in the 60s, 1968, he was doing a major study of liver cells, hepatocytes, and was surprised to discover that there was an equal concentration of copper in the mitochondria and the nuclei of these hepatocytes. Well, that's a groundbreaking observation. That it's the only study I've ever seen where there was that kind of identification of symmetry between copper status in those two intracellular settings. And so what you begin to find as you start to scratch the surface is that copper is very involved in transcription. Copper is very involved in the nucleotide guanosine. Copper is very involved in histone metabolism. And so there's a whole nother world of metabolic activity at the nuclear level, inside the nucleus, that a lot of people are not aware of. And that begins to change our whole understanding of what is a gene defect. Could it simply be a nutrient deficiency? We don't have the time, unfortunately, to go into all that, but it's a fascinating field of inquiry. And then just its recognized role in the electron transport chain. Anytime you're working with electrons, you want copper nearby. And I think the confusion that's taken place is we're all very familiar with kitchens. We've all grown up in homes and live in homes that have kitchens. And we're very aware of the appliances that run the kitchen. You know, the refrigerator, certainly the stove, the microwave. You know, these are the major appliances of a kitchen. What are they made out of? They're made out of steel. And what is steel? It's iron. And what science has done, what clinical science has done, is put a spotlight on those appliances and told us how wonderful they are. Oh, the iron inside the body is amazing. And they haven't told us about the chef. Does the stove know what the meal is going to be? Does the stove know what pot to put it in? Does the stove know what temperature to turn the oven on to cook it? And this is it's a playful exposition of here's where this is exactly where the problem is. No one's talking about the chef. And when you're inside the mitochondria and you're inside complex 4, cytochrome C oxidase, you got to focus on the chef, not the stove. And there literally is the heme A and A3 structure critical, and it does hold oxygen. But who's slicing and dicing it and putting the 4 electrons and 4 hydrogen protons on it to make sure that it becomes water? And that's the role of copper. And we can thank Otto Warburg back in the 1920s for confusing the heck out of everybody with his respiratory ferment, Atmungsferment. And it goes all the way back to the 1920s. Again, alas, we don't have the time to get into it right now. The other thing I want to point out is that one of my heroes is Dr. Lutsenko at Johns Hopkins, born and raised in Baltimore, nicknamed Baltimorely. And I think Hopkins is where it's at, very prestigious institution. And in a study that she did with one of her doctoral students, Dr. Hattori, back in 2016, she reveals that there's virtually no unbound copper inside the cell. You know, femto to zeptomolar, we're talking about absurd levels of littleness. I'm not sure that's a word, but consequently, intracellular copper is most likely never free. And unfortunately, that's not the meme that people have heard throughout their life. So it's time for the scientists to get their due and let people understand what's really going on. So here's a molecule of oxygen, and we use it to create energy. And we've got to have the mechanism to clear the exhaust. When oxygen isn't cleanly converted into 2H2O, it's going to become an oxidant, an accident with oxygen. And copper is in fact the agent to work both sides. It's amazing that it can work both sides of the fence. And there's one atom of copper for about 60 atoms of iron. Now, what's important to understand is what's the perspective of traditional Chinese medicine. Well, they focus on copper as the general and iron as the foot soldier. It's a very illustrative description of their distinction. And we know it takes a lot less generals to run a lot of foot soldiers. And that's the case inside our body. But unfortunately, what's happened is all the spotlights are on the foot soldier and not enough spotlights on the generals. And so there's critical enzyme activity that's directed by copper and equally important activity that's influenced by iron status. And if copper is not bioavailable, it's not functional. And again, the difference is that when we're studying copper, it's easy to measure the level of a protein or an enzyme, but we're not allowed to measure its activity, its IQ. Well, it's one thing to know the height of someone, it's another thing to know their IQ. And we're not allowed to know the IQ of these copper enzymes. And that's the basis of our physiology. Copper is distributed in very specific ways. The biggest bulk of copper is found in our bone marrow. Not a lot of people know that. Another big bulk is found in our muscle, as you would expect, given all the ATP activity there. Another 27% in the organs. And there are probably a dozen authors who've analyzed this. This seems to be a kind of a middle ground, if you will. But key representation of copper in key organs, the liver, the brain, the heart, and the kidneys. Again, high metabolic activity that requires significant production of energy to support that activity. And 1% of copper is found in the blood. But of that 1%, 95% of the 1% is supposed to be bound to a protein, Ceruloplasmin, was discovered in 1948 by two Swedish physiologists. They probably thought they discovered the Holy Grail and probably were shocked when people weren't excited about it. But when you see it written up in articles, what they'll tell you is that 95% of serum copper is supposed to be attached to ceruloplasmin, but they don't talk about the other 99% distribution that's not easily measured. That's where the catch is. So when people are talking about, oh, you're copper toxic based on a hair test or a blood test, you should say, well, what about the other 99%? Let's talk about that. And the question that's never asked is, what caused copper to leave the cuproenzymes, especially the master antioxidant enzyme in our body? It's not glutathione. Glutathione's a joke compared to ceruloplasmin because it can express 20 different enzyme functions. It's 20 copper binding sites, folks, for the ceruloplasmin gene. And that's really, really important. But no one's asking, well, why? And what was the chemical agitator in the body that caused the copper to come out of the ceruloplasmin? We can think of some. Ascorbic acid would be an obvious one. Antibiotics, hormone replacement therapy, birth control pills. These are all known agents to disrupt the conformational structure of ceruloplasmin. It's been studied very carefully since the 50s. So there's a lot of confusion because people who love to play the copper toxicity card never tell you about, well, let's talk about the copper enzymes. And let's talk about the master copper and protein, ceruloplasmin. Copper's been around a long time. I think you all know that. The earliest writing about copper is the Smith Papyrus, 2500 BC. Other writings, the Ebers Papyrus, 1500 BC. Hippocrates was known to work with copper. Celsus talked about copper as well. And of course, different civilizations have worked with copper for millennia, but we don't seem to know that. And it's fascinating to learn that copper stops cholera and chlorosis. And this goes back to hundreds of years ago in Paris, where they discovered this, that the people who worked in the copper mines didn't get these infections and didn't have these maladies. So the beauty of working with copper is that it kills pathogens, but it strengthens humans. That's pretty cool. There's not one pathogen that will be able to survive contact with copper. It's very powerful, has a unique frequency. It's been well studied now, even in the post-COVID era. And where we are is about 100 years ago, they started adding iron. Well, about 80 years ago, they started adding iron filings to our food system, iron supplements. They introduced antibiotics. That's a lecture in and of itself, which we won't have a chance to go into. But what's happened is, by using iron, what are we doing? Well, we're feeding pathogens because they live on iron, and we're weakening the human. I just read this yesterday. This one author said, copper status is what it's the foundation of nutritional immunity. And what did they start doing in 1941? Adding iron filings, which weakens copper status in the body. So 98% of the time, historically, has been this emphasis on copper, and we've had this little window around iron. It's been a very unsettling period. And so copper has a unique role, as I said, with chlorosis, with cholera, even with cholesterol. Work of Leslie Clavet back in the 70s to prove that it was a copper deficiency that was causing the cholesterol flare-up. And Big Pharma was faced with a struggle. Should we use 5 cents worth of copper or use $5 worth of a statin? And I think you all know where that came out. So another study by Dr. Lutsenko with another one of her students, looking at the transport proteins that work with copper. Very, very important information about the historical movement of copper on this planet. And these copper ATPases, are very, very important. And what evolved was the importance of enzymes, critical enzymes that allowed the organism to get access to this magical mineral that allows us to work with both iron and oxygen. And it's very well chronicled in many studies. This is just a particularly poignant one. And employing copper in biology necessitated the development of molecular machinery in the delivery, distribution, and export of copper from the cell. Well, it led to pictures like this. This is just a very crude cartoon, if you will, of what's going on inside the body. But what's key is these elements that are in a black field with white letters. These are critical mechanisms to move copper inside the cell that no one seems to understand, certainly at a professional level. And this very flippant, oh, you're copper toxic, it's almost insulting to hear that, because they've not taken the time to understand what are the dynamics. And there are significant studies around each of these transporters and how vulnerable they are, how critical they are, but they're not well understood in mainstream circles. And the key message that I want to make here is that the front door for getting copper into the cell is this protein called CTR1, copper transporter 1. It's very simple. If there's no copper, there's no CTR1. And so when someone doesn't have adequate levels of copper in their diet, which is why we put such a premium on having copper, that front door disappears. It degrades. And then there is no entrance of copper into the organism. So that's an important thing to understand, that it is a supply side dynamic. You've got to supply it regularly in order to maintain this machinery that really runs our celery, our cells and our metabolism. This is a famous study by Roger Prohaska or Joseph, excuse me, Joseph, his middle name is Roger, but Joseph Prohaska from 2011, where he profiles the main copper enzymes. It's like, well, that's close. And he's obviously putting emphasis on these multi-copper oxidases. They're very, very important in our metabolism. But what's important to understand is that there are many, many different mechanisms and proteins and enzymes that are involved in management of copper. And this is a work of Dr. Kaler. He was a major player at NIH for much of his career. I think he's now at Ohio State Medical Center, but he was a pediatrician who just studied copper in a very unique way. And so there's many mechanisms that people just are not aware of. And this particular chaperone, ATOX, antioxidant 1, is critical for many of the key copper enzymes that people are aware of. But what's key to that is understanding that ATOX1 is really feeding ATP7A and ATP7B. So this gets into some very intricate nuancing, and I'm not trying to overwhelm you. I just want you to know there's a lot of steps to the process. And we feel very comfortable with this information and being able to work closely with it in our discussions. And one of my other favorite enzymes is the PAM enzyme that is unbelievably important because it activates 13 neurotransmitters and hormones in our body. A lot of people don't know about that. And the A there stands for alpha amidating. Well, when you put an amide group on a hormone, it's very different when it has that amine group attached to it. And these are not all the enzymes. There are many more. And even this addition that I've added here, that's not even all of them as well. So there's so many layers of information. And it's like they took this repository of information about copper before the First World War, and it's like they blew it up into 10,000 parts. And it's just a very gradual process of trying to reassemble it and really understand it. And so then this particular protein, ATP7A, the Menkes protein, plays profound roles in our body of being able to develop key cupro enzymes. ATP7B is instrumental for ceruloplasmin. ATP7A is critical for everything else that involves copper. And so here it is displayed in a slightly different format. And what you'll see is glutathione, which is that big green circle circled in red. Glutathione is really the greeter in our cells. And it's a critical antioxidant function. I'm not disputing that. But if you don't have glutathione, it means you don't have copper, because glutathione is a copper-dependent pathway. And so another study by Dr. Lutsenko, where she really profiles these critical enzymes, you begin to get an appreciation for their role. Just different versions of the same cartoon, but it's important to get multiple perspectives. And this was one that Dr. Crichton reached out to back in 2019. He's the reigning dean of iron biology on planet Earth, and he identifies the leading studies throughout the research circles, and he tapped Dr. Lutsenko's study about copper enzymes in his book. So there's just layers and layers and layers of information that are out there to try to begin to bring it into crystal focus. There's a relationship between iron and vitamin D and sugar. Very powerful connections between those three elements, in the same way that there's a powerful relationship between copper and fat and vitamin A. And in the same way that iron is magnetic, copper is electric, and that's really the origin of electromagnetism. Iron's driving that gravity that we have on the planet. Copper is providing the levity that we have on the planet. Very important forces. But again, general foot soldier. They're not of equal stature in terms of their concentration. And I think what we've got is the distinction between different healing modalities of attacking the guest and strengthening the host. Well, trust me, the guest is looking for iron and the host is really trying to strengthen its ability to make energy so that the immune system can think and act and react and take corrective action. And unfortunately, there was not enough attention placed on that function over the last couple of years, and we can have an open debate about that at some point. But what's happened in our environment is they pretty much shut down copper and fat and vitamin A. They're not popular nutrients to focus on outside of the RCP. And there's been enormous uptick in iron and sugar and vitamin D. And trust me, the two do not mix. And so one study of cereals that have sugar in them and iron and all sorts of goodies, but this particular study underestimated the amount of iron in the cereal by a factor of 380%. Well, that's a significant deviation from the truth. And as I noted, copper is the #1 deficiency on the farm, nutrient deficiency. So you've got this paucity of copper and this explosion of iron in the food system. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. And so it begins to challenge the unique properties of copper, and you begin to appreciate the volatility of iron and what its role can be inside the body, especially in a copper deficiency state. The aspects of copper that I think are most important are its ability to convert oxygen into water to create energy. And so oxygen needs to be activated in order to have that function. And it's a very precise series of mechanisms that the complex 4 goes through, all at the direction of the chef. Can't do it without the stove. I get that. But when copper can't be activated, the stove disappears. It's fascinating how the body adapts to its environment. So the whole series of steps that take place, and the movement of electrons are really what are key inside the complex. And when these actions do not take place cleanly and completely or naturally, that's when we get accidents with oxygen, otherwise known as oxidative stress. We've studied this intensely, is to understand how energy is made. Energy metabolism is one of the key cornerstones of regaining your health. The other side is the ability to detox the oxidants. And so there's a whole process of individually clearing these oxidants. And the beauty of copper is it has the ability to go in one fell swoop. It can turn oxygen into water. That's the beauty of copper's presence and why it's so important on this planet. So real quick to focus in on where we are, and we'll be wrapping up in the next few minutes. This is how most studies present iron metabolism as a solo agent. Oh, you need to know about iron. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of studies that just focus on iron and tell you about transferrin. And very rarely, they'll mention ferroxidase activity, but not tell you who's running the show. Then we get into the copper side, and there are hundreds of articles that will describe the interface between copper and iron, and that's important, but very few that really get into the nuts and bolts of it. And then we find that there are only dozens of articles that tell us what ceruloplasmin is all about. What is its unique role? Why is it so essential? Why is it critical for the fetus and the pregnant mother to have all 3 expressions of ferroxidase enzyme, ceruloplasmin, hephaestin, and cyclopen? And for those of you out there who are either pregnant or know someone who is pregnant, ask them about that. How is your doctor measuring all 3 of those proteins? Ceruloplasmin, hephaestin, and cyclopen? Harry McCardle up at in Aberdeen University thinks it's pretty important, but doesn't seem to make it through the threshold of obstetrics worldwide. But the point that we want to make is that iron does not regulate itself. Iron, despite what you may know or what you think you know or what you've been taught, is iron does not regulate itself. And iron is like a 4-year-old with a hammer. And no one in their right mind would give their child, their 4-year-old child, a hammer and then go next door and have a cup of coffee with their neighbor. Just wouldn't do it. And the challenge we've got is really gifted iron biologists like Dr. Sheftel up in Canada, making the following statement. The precise mechanism by which ceruloplasmin promotes iron efflux from macrophages and other cells remains uncertain. Really? That's fascinating. Because it's the recycling macrophages that enable the 2.5 million red blood cells to be made every second. Because they got to give up the iron for the 2.5 million that are dying every second. That's a pretty bold statement for someone to make. And so let's take another look at this. This is what I've pieced together over the last few years, is we got to start with copper, very often in a +2 state. It's got to become +1 state. Guess what? It's ferric reductase that makes that conversion in addition to ceruloplasmin. Fascinating when you begin to really get into the literature. There we are with that front door, CTR1, glutathione, the greeter, ATOX, the chaperone, feeding these copper pumps, ATP7A and 7B. And that is the magic that allows ceruloplasmin to become holo, to become filled with copper. And 8 copper atoms go inside that protein. That was in 1948. That was the way it was for 30 years. Suddenly in the 70s, it was 7 coppers that go in. And then 30 years later, now it's down to 6. Watch, in another 30 years, it'll be 5. So I'm not sure how they're making those changes, but it has a profound impact on our iron metabolism, because you cannot load iron onto transferrin to complete that recycling system if you don't have ceruloplasmin acting through the ferroxidase enzyme. And the key is that ceruloplasmin is not just regulating iron status, it's regulating copper status. Very, very important functions there. What I find fascinating is very few authors talk about the connection between ATP7B and transferrin, even though there is one. And here's where it gets bumpy. You all probably have heard of glutathione deficiency. Well, if you have glutathione deficiency, you have a copper deficiency. Here's the most important thing to understand, is that silver.
Sorry about that extra noise. I just had to put someone in the waiting room because I couldn't mute them. So please keep going.
So silver has a known ability to block the front door for copper. That's something good to know. So there's way more to the story. And Dr. Sheftel should know better. And so we do know how iron moves out of macrophages. It's very well chronicled. There are hundreds of articles that talk about it. And because doctors are not taught this, they do believe in anemia. And they do believe in copper toxicity. And therein lies the problem. Missing information equals missing truth. And so this is an article I came across recently about copper metabolism for influenza infections. For those of you who are gearheads, please spend time with the study. It's amazing what they are teaching us here. But what they're really focusing on in the study is using copper metabolism as a target to reduce the severity of influenza infection. Oh, we're back to innate immunity, folks. And here's the challenge. If you don't have copper in your diet, and if you are believing that you're anemic and you're taking supplements or infusions or whatever you're doing to try to offset the perception, the misperception that you are deficient in iron because it's stuck in the tissue and not showing up in the blood, that's the biggest mistake that's made. But you're not going to have the innate immunity that you need. So all sorts of dynamics around that. And this is just another variation of that same cartoon where we've got the need for copper. And iron going into the nucleus through the protein NML45, nuclear Menkes-like protein. You see copper is blocking up the doorway there, or excuse me, silver is blocking up the doorway, and silver is also affecting the cytochrome C oxidase. Very critical function. Silver is wonderful for copper deficient bodies, but copper was the original antibiotic. It really is. And so we've got to stop putting our attention on the nucleus and start focusing on where copper is making things happen through the mitochondria and the trans-Golgi network. I'm increasingly of the opinion that it's the TGN, the trans-Golgi network, that's the nerve center for the cell. It's not the nucleus. Nucleus is a Xerox machine in the corner. Mitochondria is critical. It's if there are hundreds of mitochondria per cell, but I think the absolute nerve center of the cell is the trans-Golgi network, and it's fascinating to begin to look at it from that perspective. I'll leave you with this last slide. This is, again, from that same study about the crossroads between host copper. I'd never seen these statements in a study before, and I was bowled over and wanted to share them with you. And I'm sorry we're running a little late, I apologize. But this particular statement about Ceruloplasmin is earth-shattering, that Ceruloplasmin binds influenza A virus. Oh, wow, that's good to know. This can lead to a decrease in infectivity. Well, intuitively, it makes perfect sense. Why weren't we talking about that the last couple of years? That's a good question to ask. And it's a very particular property of these copper-directed proteins and their enzyme functions. And then the one that really also caught my eye was the role that copper plays in autophagy. And it's fascinating to begin to look at that. And it begs the question, could dysfunctional autophagy be the fact that maybe the body doesn't have enough copper to run this key copper pump to feed the enzymes that are driving the autophagy? And here's the connection between glutathione peroxidase. And I know I'm going a mile a second, I apologize. But there's so much more to the story than just you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And so the point that I'll leave you with is that iron is meant to be recycled. It's not meant to be stored. And that's the twist in physiology that's been taking place since 1972. And we've got to get beyond that and get back to the original programming of our physiology. And so it's even in the Bible. I won't get into all of this, but it's fascinating that even in the Sistine Chapel, there's mention of the copper serpent to save the Israelites. So this, of course, is the origin of the caduceus. And if we had more time, I'd go into more detail, but it's fascinating to think about the role that copper has played through antiquity to protect humanity. So that was a lot of ground to cover, and we're near the end. But from our standpoint, in order to achieve optimal health, we've got to eliminate the stops within the RCP, phase in the starts, eat an ancestral diet, whole food ancestral diet. It's local, seasonal, it's colorful. Ideally, that you've had conversations with farmers at the farmers market so you understand their philosophy, their commitment to growing healthy soil and healthy produce and healthy animals. Become aware of and manage your stressors. That's what this whole process is about, is we're trying to really address the sources of stress. The greatest stress on the planet for humans is iron stress. It's well recognized by iron biologists because of its affinity to make oxidative stress. But it originates as iron stress. So we put a lot of emphasis on that. And there are a whole series of other processes that we talk about, both within the RCP handbook and within the book, Cure Your Fatigue. The handbook, if you go to our website, rcp123.org or the rootcauseprotocol.com, you can access the handbook, donate your email address, and we'll happily protect that information, but also share a 50-page document shares what the specifics are of the protocol and how to do it, how to phase it in. It's just a great and useful guide to help you with your recovery. It's a community where people are able to access this information. And twice a month, we have spirited discussions with Q&As, and wonderful questions get asked. We had a meeting just last week where one of the members was celebrating, I think she was in her late 60s, early 70s, celebrating how much better she felt after 3 months on the protocol. And another member later in the program said, well, my journey's been a little longer. It's taken me 3 years, but I've turned the corner and I feel so much better. So why the 3 months, 3 years, we don't know. A lot of variables involved, but some wonderful case studies and testimonials in that community, like-minded people seeking to gain their autonomy, if you will, and restore their energy production. There's no censorship, of course. And as I said, we have the Q&As, and there are many, many programs and meetings that we've had that are on file that you can access and get a historical record of what we've discussed. And of course, the webinars like these that you would have access to as well. Again, that's all part of the RCP community. And then for those that really want to take it to another level of understanding, we have the Institute twice a year. We're just starting the class 16 or group 16. Class number 2 is this Thursday, Friday for those down under. And we've got the biggest class we've ever had, 220 people. Very exciting. And we'd love to have you join us and look forward to seeing you in group 17 if you decide to take the plunge. And that's our overview of copper. I apologize again for running about 10 minutes over, but I wanted to sneak in some really recent research that I've come across and took a gamble that I could do it in time. And I got close, but I didn't quite win the cigar today. So that's our story. And Christine, I'll turn it back over to you, and I'll have you bring us to a close if you would.
No worries at all. So I have opened up the chat again. A lot of people were messaging me towards the end with questions. So we did keep the chat quiet for everybody to be able to focus. If you have a question, obviously we've gone over time, so we're not going to be able to answer them today, but you're welcome to put them in the chat now, and we will bring them up during our later Q&A. So just to be absolutely clear on what that looks like, we have a Q&A that will be happening in just under 2 weeks. It's 13 days from now, which is all about Recuperate, which is Morley's new copper-based product. And I will grab the link for that in a moment, or Teresa or one of the team, if they have a chance to go and grab it, that would be awesome. That will specifically talk about copper supplementation and answer questions specifically about Recuperate. Then our normal programming is that 2 weeks from now, we will have a Q&A for our RCP membership. So Morley, a couple of slides back, had the information about our community, and I've put a link already in the chat to do with joining the community. If you would like to hear the answers to the questions that have either been sent to me privately or coming into the chat now, then you'll be able to get those answered there. So it'll be in a Zoom session like this, but we'll group the questions together. Let me just quickly check. Yes, the recording will be sent to everybody who has registered. So within the next 24 or 48 hours, generally, there'll be replay information sent so that you can access that. Anyone who is a member, you can go straight into the membership area, and it's under the webinars heading once it's uploaded in general. Thanks, Jean, for the Recuperate link. Let me just grab, I think it's important for people to have the sign up to the Q&A. Leanne said, confused about membership emails received lately, we'll try to sort it out. yeah, contact support. There was a glitch in our system, and we did email a whole lot of people and had a whole lot of fun there. So there was an email offering if people wanted to do a trial on the community that they could, as a thank you for and an apology for that not having gone exactly as we planned. I've nearly got that link. Hopefully, here we go. Well, nope, that's not the right one. Sorry, everybody. Been a lot going on behind the scenes here.
I can only imagine.
I think John has grabbed it for me. Yep. Thanks so much, John. So for that one, it's another free event Q&A where everybody can sign up to join, and it'll be a session like this dedicated to Recuperate. And then about just under 24 hours later, we'll have the membership Q&A, which is in the paid area. So, all right, I think I've covered all that I needed to. There was a lot covered today. If you're not technically minded and that flew over your head, apologies. Please watch it again. Take it slower, and you'll be able to perhaps take in more. Again, come to the Q&As and learn a bit more. I know there was a question about the clinical side of how to get more copper. We will talk about that during the Recuperate side of things. It's always food-based when it comes to the RCP, wherever possible. So Ernie said it felt like biochem all over.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and the intent was not to try to overwhelm you with the science. It's just there's such depth to the research, and we've got to get past this narrative that copper's the problem. No, copper's missing. Copper's the missing link to our metabolism. And in subsequent discussions in the Q&A sessions, we'll have a chance to get into that in a much deeper way.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And a good question was raised. Sheila said, will reminders come? So if you sign up for the Recuperate event, just like this event, you'll get reminders. If you click on the link that I've put into the chat at the moment, or if you're watching the replay, you click on the Recuperate link in that area, and it comes up with an error. Please be aware that means that 99% likely you have actually already signed up. So you don't need to panic and contact support and say it hasn't worked. It's likely that it has worked, and that it's you've just signed up twice. Unfortunately, the people who we use to facilitate our sign up process don't have a really great, you've already signed up for this page. They just give an error instead. So, all right, I think I have covered everything that I can cover. Thank you for the questions. We will capture those and put them into the future presentations. And there's lots of thanks in the chat, Morley. So I think people have overall enjoyed it, even with the tech, heavy tech stuff, or the biochemistry reminders.
And hopefully people could hear me, I hope.
I think most people could. There were a few who had challenges, but I'm hoping they'll catch the replay. And next time, if they have headphones, that may help a bit too.
Yeah, okay, good point.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody.
Well, appreciate you taking the time. Okay.
Too easy. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.